Hello and welcome to episode 11 of Diary of a Folk Witch. Diaries are somewhere where we can record our deepest feelings and secrets, but some secrets are worth sharing, so join me in my walk through living folk witchcraft through the use of diary entries, informative discussions and occasionally the odd monograph or two. Welcome to my world. Date, October 20th, 2024. Weather, around 7 degrees, stormy, cold, wet and very windy. Moon phase, waning gibbous. Location, home, Lancashire. It is cold and dark. You can certainly tell that we're now turning our eyes towards Samhain. The nights are drawing in, the air has a crispness to it, the leaves are falling, and tonight the wind comes howling down from the moors. But I am safely tucked up at home, and thankfully able to observe the wind, rain, and swaying trees from the safety and warmth that is the haven of my home. You may remember that in the last episode I spoke of how some of my children came down with scarlet fever. Well, despite it being an illness usually experienced only by children, I managed to catch it while nursing my children back to health. The virus itself was unpleasant, but not as bad as it was for the children. It has, however, unfortunately, triggered my body to experience a relapse with two health conditions that I have, both ME and fibromyalgia. This has made doing any garden work, cooking and even walking almost impossible for the last week or so. But it's not the end of the world. Sometimes our body slows us down so that we can focus on other areas of our lives. Quiet pastimes that offer rest and recuperation at the same time. And for me, there's been doing crochet, writing my next article for Pagan Door magazine, and learning how to use a drop spindle. All non-labour intensive projects that are still heavily imbued with magic, but allow my body to rest and recover at the same time. This evening I've worked on a jumper from one of my sons using crochet. It was a simple task and not obviously magical to the outside observer, but in reality a task full of folk magic. My mother taught me all about the folk ways and folk magic of crochet when I was a child. How to use certain colour yarns for certain magical intentions. For example, blue for healing or blue for the protection offered by the Holy Mother, green for wealth or grounding, pink for love and affection, red for a pregnant mother to offer her womb, the protection from all of the ancestors who came before her in her mother line, red the colour of the ancestors, and so on. She taught me how certain fibres had different magical qualities to others, and how words, chants and prayers could be spoken either in every stitch or into specific increases or decreased stitches. The jumper I'm making for my youngest son is in blue, but not for healing or any protection that the Holy Mother or any other goddess-like deity could offer, but because it is a calming colour energy, something that is much needed in my youngest son, who is like a bull in a china shop and the oncoming storm all wrapped up into one. But still, I suppose it's what you get when you name your son after a god of storms and thunder. I suppose there is a lesson there. Be careful what name you choose when you're naming a child. Names, after all, like colours, have energies and powers all of their very own. There is actually a storm tonight. Local attractions around the northwest of England, such as Speak Hall down in Liverpool, have supposedly closed early so that staff and members of the public can get home early and safely. Government travel warnings have been offered and yellow weather warning alerts issued. But to be honest, although the wind is howling and the trees are heavy with the bustling and thrusting of its energy, I have seen far worse storms. I have been watching the storm this evening while doing my crochet. It's been fascinating to watch. especially from the safety and comfort of my nice warm sofa and blanket, to stare out into the darkness of night through the patio windows and watch the trees sway and the rose bush blow. All the while knowing that me and my family are safe and warm and comfortable. This is peace, and a truly wonderful blessing. But now I have stopped watching the storm from the warm comfort of my living room and have put away the crochet. It's time for bed, because now the midnight hour approaches, and as I lay in the darkness of my room, under the warmth of my bedding, typing away on the journal pad of my phone, a different sort of wind picks up, a sighing sort of wind that seems to sweep up from the field outside and then whistles around the side of our house. It snatches my attention because it sounds different to the wind of earlier in the evening, less aggressive in its nature and more haunting. I hear its whistling tones rise as it flies on the outside walls of the guttering and then swoops down through the poplar tree that stands at the bottom of the garden, rustling every leaf that still remains on the waning branches. I am not afeared, though. Afeared. I love that word. Afraid is a word so used, so much in our modern language. And although both afeared and afraid mean technically the same thing, the word afraid seems to be more applicable when someone is genuinely in fear. Where afeared, to me at least, it's a good substitute word for when one is not exactly deeply afraid or worried, but more unsettled from a sense of creeping unease and disturbance, where one knows they are safe and yet that sound, that creaking on the stair, that whistling sound outside, or the memory of that ghost story from earlier leaves us feeling wobbled, afeared, irrational as that may be. This is how I like to use the word afeared now, to personally distinguish between such emotions of the generic fear that the word afraid conjures up, and the more complex unease we feel around the supernatural. Needless splitting of hairs in regards to the English language, maybe, but I like it. Since moving to Lancashire nearly 10 years ago, and now being in close proximity to the moors, I have become accustomed to the winds that sweep down from those bare and expansive moorlands, those lands that rise above the villages and nearby suburban towns, and this is why I am not afeared tonight. Every now and then spirits of the moors travel down on the wind into suburbia, especially around the time of Samhain, and cause mischief, haunting certain lonely spots or scaring residents by tapping on windows and so on. Boggarts, some locals call them, and perhaps some of these spirits are, but for the most part, I think most of these spirits that often get swept up by the wind or choose to journey on it freely are something far older, spirits of the land that are perhaps as old as the land and the gods themselves. Spirits do seem to wander more freely as we head towards Samhain and All Souls' Day. Another gust of wind whistles around the left side of the house, this time louder than the last, and it sets our ducks to startling, their congruous quacking seemingly in agreement that something is on the air tonight. And what if there is something on the wind tonight? It doesn't bother me. My family and I are safely tucked up in the sanctuary of our home well protected with wards, charms and guardians. The ducks and the chickens too are safe. After a spate of unexplained illnesses and deaths and some quails and chickens about 18 months ago, my husband and I took the precaution of placing specific protective charms around their pens. The deaths and illnesses stopped immediately. Make of that what you will. Another whistle now, this time not the wind, a horrible, eerie whistle that someone nearby uses as a dog training method. It's early tonight. I usually hear it between 2 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. and it wakes me up. I know what it is, it's nothing supernatural, and yet it always makes me feel uncomfortable. It breaks the nighttime silence with a piercing suddenness and sounds so out of place. When the whistle blows, a dog barks. I assume this pet is let out to relieve itself in the night, and the owner blows on the whistle to signal the dog to come back in. I smirk. This reminds me of The Hound of the Baskervilles and how the killer uses a whistle to control the hound in one of the adaptations I've seen on television. It's interesting though, isn't it, how whistling can make us feel uncomfortable, especially in the night. Perhaps this stems from the fact that all too often whistles, whistling and flutes are often associated with the occult or the ability to summon or control beasts and spirits. I myself have a beautiful handmade bone flute. Such instruments are sometimes used within some streams of folk magic for the purposes of journeying or necromancy. However, this particular dog whistle that I can hear at night is an unusual sound. It's not like one of those dog whistles where humans are not supposed to be able to hear it, nor is it a typical whistle. It makes a sound that I struggle to replicate. For weeks I've tried to explain the sound to my husband, to the point where he was starting to think it was part of my dreams or that I was pulling his leg. But then he heard it himself one night. But it begs the question though, doesn't it? Why is whistling so unsettling? Why does the sound of whistling, especially at night, make us stop still and often initiate a fight or flight response within us? Whistling as a prelude to fear, a bad omen, or a sign of ghosts occurs in urban legends and folklore and ghost stories all around the world. From classic ghost stories such as M.R.James's Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, a personal favourite of mine, to the Venezuelan El Cibon, a supernatural being said to be the ghost of a man who killed his father and is now cursed to walk the land carrying a bag full of bones and whistling in the night. Whistling is also a taboo in some cultures, including my own upbringing. Growing up as I did in an Anglo-Irish family, there were lots of little rules and rituals that had to be adhered to in order to either please the spirits or keep them away, such as the practice of covering mirrors whenever a loved one died so that their spirits would not become trapped within the liminal space of the mirror, or not restarting clocks if they'd stopped at a time that a loved one passed away. To do so would mean that their spirit would never rest. To never knock on walls or doors inside the home between dusk and dawn, as this would attract ghosts or evil spirits. To always keep your curtains drawn at night to stop spirits peeping in at you and possibly even bewitching or attaching themselves to you while you slept. And the big no-no, never, ever whistle in the house, especially at night. This invites not only ghosts, but supposedly also the devil. This last example also seems to cross over into Romany folkways too, as my husband is even more strict than I am on not whistling inside the home. When our daughter attempted to tease me and whistle indoors, my husband scolded her and told her that it was never to be done, and that his ancestors believed that it could bring bad luck and even death to whistle inside the Vardo or the home. I also recently found out that apparently many Indigenous Americans also believe that it's unlucky to look outside at night, knock on the walls inside the home, or whistle in the home. It seems that the unease that whistling creates is very much cross-cultural. I strongly suspect that this is possibly stemming from some form of deep genetic memory from our ancient ancestors, those who lived in a time where whistling in the night meant humans signalling to one another, and possibly even a camp invasion under the cover of darkness. It may even be from when we were hunter-gatherers and used physical signs and whistling to indicate prey or dangerous animals nearby. In a more modern context, I find that many women dislike whistling because they immediately associate it with misogyny, catcalling, and being generally pestered by some men who think it's fun or even attractive to whistle at a woman who is simply walking by and minding her own business. If we look back again in history and we look towards some sailing superstitions, it was supposedly bad luck to whistle when the wind was good, as it would stop the wind. Whistling on ship was thought to challenge the wind and could even summon storms. And yet, despite all of these negative connotations with both whistling and the wind, both have been firm allies to the witch throughout time. old Cornish witches were said to be able to whistle up the wind, meaning they could summon good or bad weather for sailors. This somewhat echoes too to the 1590 Scottish North Berwick witch trials, where witches were accused of raising storms in order to sink the king's ship, though in this instance the storm was supposedly caused by drowning a cat. However, in the northwest of England, you didn't need to sacrifice a cat or any other animal in order to summon a storm. Here in the northwest of England, it's said that if you could make a flag that was made of fabric taken from the shroud of a dead person and raise it to the wind on the beach or cliffs and whistle a specific tune, you could either summon a storm or calm it. In another piece of northwest of England folklore and folkways, I have been told that it was once a huge taboo for a woman to be caught whistling along the docks of the River Mersey in Liverpool. In fact, if a woman was caught whistling by the once hugely busy trading docks during the 1800s, she could end up being given a hiding from one of the dockers or sailors that heard her. Such was the fear that she was intentionally or unintentionally cursing the boat, that she would warrant being hit. It's scary to think that this piece of law, if it's true, then this level of physical assault was potentially accepted as normal and acceptable, as recently as just over 100 years ago. However, whistling by the docks of the River Mersey was not always about bewitching or cursing a ship. Supposedly, some wives would go to the docks and quietly and discreetly whistle certain tunes as a way of casting spells and workings in order to bring their loved ones home safely from abroad, or spouses who are out sailing on cargo ships. It's nice to think that not all of these whistling associations are negative, and that sometimes actually witches in the northwest of England were using them as a way to safely summon loved ones home. Another piece of whistling magic comes again from the northwest of England in the area of Pendle. There, if you wanted to be rid of something, you had to climb to the top of Pendle Hill, whistle to the wind, say the name of the thing that you wanted to be rid of to a piece of ribbon held in your hand, and then when the wind came as you whistled for it, you would release the ribbon to the wind, and so too would you be released of the thing that you wanted to be rid of. Likewise, if someone was seeking marriage or a baby, they would climb Pendle Hill to release a ribbon as a form of summoning that thing that they wanted. Though I do not advocate for this personally, as releasing ribbons, which are nearly always synthetic materials, is highly dangerous and damaging to local wildlife. Whistling in and around Pendle comes up again now, as I remember one time in about maybe 2019 or the start of 2020. Me and my family were up in Pendle for the day, and me and my daughter had stopped by the absolutely wonderful Witches Galore shop in Newchurch, and we were outside the shop and a lady and her friend were just about to walk past us when my daughter started whistling under her breath. And the lady saw my daughter whistling and she heard her, and she said, "Oh, you mustn't whistle round here," she said. "You must never whistle if you're in sight of Pendle Hill, otherwise the witches will hear you and they'll catch you." To which my daughter confidently replied, "It's all right, my mum's a witch, she's a real witch." I was then eyed with suspicion, and the lady continued to reiterate, "They really do say that you shouldn't whistle within sight of Pendle, or the ghosts of old Pendle witches will haunt you and catch you." "You take folklore very seriously then," I replied politely. "Of course, don't you?" I was asked in return. "I do indeed. Thank you for sharing this with us." And then we turned to walk away. The lady and her companion too left, but kept turning back to look at me. Whether they were tourists who were offered some Halloween bump that they'd swallowed hook, line and sinker, or if this was some nonsense they read somewhere, I don't know. But I have both visited and performed ritual and workings in and around Pendle for many years, and I have not once been haunted by any of the accused Pendle witches for whistling. So I think that we can chalk this tidbit up to an urban myth, but it's still worth mentioning. As a side note, it is my hope that after 413 years, the poor people from Pendle hung for witchcraft in Lancaster back in 1612 are now well and truly at peace, resting in eternal bliss, not spending their afterlife haunting anyone who dares whistle, of all things, within sight of Pendle Hill. One piece of established witch lore on whistling is documented in the book The Devil in Lancashire by Vera Winterbottom, which states, "A whistling woman and a crowing hen will scare the devil out his den." Now, this is interesting, as historically Lancashire was a county known for its infestation of witches and rebels, and, as such, has often been referred to as a dark corner of the land. Many women practice witchcraft, and seemingly openly so, if we look at the history around Pendle witch trials, where both the Chattox and the Demdike clans not only practiced their witchery openly, but competed with each other for business. It may make some sense then, at least, that if anyone could scare the devil or some form of evil spirit, it would be a woman invoking the unearthly and eerie tool of whistling. The idea of a chicken crowing being able to scare the devil is a little bit more complicated to unravel. It could be that hens clucking and cockerels crowing signalled the coming of light and the blessing of dawn. It could even be that hens represent fertility through the laying of eggs. Fertility magic and ritual has long been a power that has been both sacred and baffling to the church, and seemingly also Satan for millennia. There is a fascinating piece of art by Charles Ison called Devil of Popefig Island, in which a woman seemingly appalls and terrifies a demon by flashing her genitalia to him. Of course, the chicken is also directly related to witchcraft and divination too. Within various cultures, everything from chicken poop and entrails can and has been examined to divine future outcomes of events. Here in Lancashire, I've been told that there are several ways of performing divination while using chickens. Everything from observing the shape and splatter of the chicken's poop, to checking the condition of the eggs, how a chicken walks and what plants it chooses to nibble on or stay away from, are all legitimate forms of assessing divination for outcomes after a question has been put to the chicken. Speaking as someone who keeps both chickens and ducks, I can assure you that I have not tried any of those before mentioned forms of divination. I don't really fancy going through my chicken's poop, for example, in the hopes of getting insight into a much needed question. Moving away from Pendle now, we now come to the concept of the Seven Whistlers, which is a concerning omen within established British folklore. One I know a little about, as my great-grandfather on my mother's side was a coal miner in the northeast of England. The Seven Whistlers is said to be a death omen made up of the sound of either 7 witches, 7 demons, or most commonly 7 birds. To hear the 7 whistlers meant that there would be a sudden and unexpected death soon. The 7 whistlers were supposedly heard by pit workers in Northumbria the night before a pit disaster in 1862, and in 1874 many colliers in Warwickshire supposedly refused to go to work because some had heard the 7 whistlers the night before. The bird, thought to be predominantly responsible for the cries and whistling sounds in the night, is thought to be that of the curlew, but others will insist instead it is a cacophony of many birds suddenly calling out in the night for no apparent reason. There is a beautiful folk song called The 7 Whistlers by Sarah Dear Jones. If you get a chance to listen to it, it's a sad folk lament but well worth it. The lyrics are: "The curlew's cries foretell our doom, it serenades us to our tomb. Of 7 whistlers all have flown, the cruellest winds of fate have blown. The turtle dove she sang our pain, the skylark too is lost in vain. Of 7 whistlers all have flown, the cruellest winds of fate have blown. I search the farmland's empty sky, for sparrows chirp and lapwings cry. Of 7 whistlers all have flown, the cruellest winds of fate have blown. The woodcock and the nightingale, their haunting calls the woods bewail. Of 7 whistlers all have flown, the cruellest winds of fate have blown. The curlew's cry foretells our doom, it serenades us to our tomb. Of 7 whistlers all have flown, the cruellest winds of fate have blown." In this song, The singer clearly highlights 7 specific birds, which is interesting as not every person or region in England can or will agree on what the birds are, or even if they are all birds. But Sarah Dear-Jones lists the curlew, skylark, turtledove, sparrow, lapwing, nightingale and woodcock. Many moons ago, back when I studied performing arts at college, drama school and university, and also did some stage work, I was informed on multiple occasions that it was unlucky to whistle while on stage, that it could bring down the curtain or curse the production, even cause accidents. One particularly eccentric director that I worked with whilst I did work experience as stage management for a production at the Croydon Clock Tower in my final year of college went absolutely berserk when technical staff were whistling whilst rigging lights on stage. The director went off on an absolute tirade of how whistling will ruin the first night's show, curse the show, cause accidents and so on. In the end, both myself and as stage manager and the technical staff members had to firmly and in a few choice words tell the director to be quiet and compose themselves or leave. So they composed themselves, but the odd thing was we did encounter a few electrical hiccups that day after the whistling incident. Coincidence or down to whistling? Who knows? But the first night's production went absolutely fine and I realised that stage management wasn't for me. Too much handling of drama queens for my liking, both on stage and off stage. But I did keep up with my acting and musical theatre and I still love it to this day. And yet, despite all these incidences of whistling being treated as dangerous and taboo, few would bat an eye at someone whistling during the day. Annoying as it may be, my previous window cleaner used to whistle all the time and seemingly never bothered anyone but me with it. Another example of more positive whistling comes from London, where it is said that it's lucky for the men of the family to whistle "Here Comes the Bride" to the bride on the morning of her wedding. Whistling is also used a lot within construction, train drivers and the famous London black cabbies as a way of getting each other's attention and to greet one another. As I type this, I remember my nan telling me stories about growing up during World War II. Not only was she able to tell me lots of fascinating things about rationing or how the Blitz impacted Croydon and central London, but also her own evacuation because she was evacuated twice, the folkways practised during the war for protection, and little stories about her father who had been an ARP warden. This great-grandfather of mine had avoided the call-up of the war due to having a reserved occupation as a dental technician, but he had chosen to give up his spare time and volunteer as an ARP warden and then, I believe, later as a member of the Home Guard. He, Edward that is, shared stories after the war that it wasn't uncommon for ARP wardens and members of the Home Guard to have secret and discreet whistling systems. Certain whistled tunes meant survivors found in bombed out buildings, others meant fatalities, and some whistles could even indicate black market items for sale. You have to admire the sheer ingeniousness of it all. It's almost, but not quite, like a wartime language system all of its very own. So why then is there usually a stark difference between whistling at night and whistling in the day? Well, I think in part it comes down to context. If someone was whistling in the day, there was a good chance that they were being productive, and you could see who was doing it. In general, we also usually feel safer in the daylight. Everything is awake and alert, but whistling at night, well, that could be anyone or anything. And they, like the ARP wardens of World War II, could be signalling anything, and you would not necessarily know what. Like our ancestors who lived in communal camps, a whistle in the dark could signal danger, either from rival clans trying to steal food or something summoning some creature in the night. I think this is why the sound of the wind hitting the certain tones or whistling at night gets to us. It triggers a primal response, and no one up to anything good usually whistles in the night. I hope you've enjoyed this week's entry and will join me again next time. From the time, mists and distance between us, blessings from me to you. Thank you so much for joining me again this week. If you would like to see any more of my work, you can check it out at diaryofafolkwitch.com. Otherwise, you can follow me over on Facebook and Instagram under the account Diary of a Folk Witch. Once again, I am still in the process of trying to set up a Patreon account. I really do appreciate those of you who've reached out and asked to support me over on Patreon. I will let you know as soon as that is set up. Thank you and have a lovely week.